Good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our first Black, Brown and Green Voices interview or program for the spring of 2023. I can't believe we're in the spring already. And today is, of course, people will be aware, today is the first day of Black History Month in the United States. But today I'm coming to you from Dublin. I'm here in the centre of Dublin with our wonderful speaker for today's programme, Jude Hughes. And in a moment, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Kim DaCosta in the US to introduce Jude more formally. Just before we get going, some housekeeping matters just to be aware of. We'll run for no more than 60 minutes, so we'll finish at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time and 6:30 p.m. Irish Time, just in case anyone is on watching the clock. We are recording this programme and it will be published later on the Luxman Ireland House NYU YouTube channel if you'd like to watch it back. We have enabled closed captions, so for anyone who needs those, or if you just want to hit the CC button at the bottom of the screen, if you'd like to enable them at home there for yourselves. This programme comes together under the auspices of the African American Irish Diaspora Network, which I have the pleasure of being on the board on, along with my colleague Kim DaCosta, and also out of Luxman Ireland House NYU Centre for the Study of Ireland and the Irish Diaspora. We bring you these programmes in promotional partnership with our colleagues at NYU at the John Brademas Centre. Always grateful for the collaboration with Tom and Polly there in bringing these programs to their audience, and to our friends at the wonderful NYPL Schomburg Centre for Research in Black Culture, a really important institution in terms of the kinds of research intersections we're interested in, and grateful to Sonia and to Joy Bivens and everyone at NYPL for their support. Of course, we're grateful to African American Irish Diaspora Network for championing this programme as well. I'll stop talking soon, and if you've questions for Jude, please don't hesitate to pose them in the chat or Q&A function, and we'll try to get as many as we can. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague from NYU and from the African American Irish Diaspora Network, Professor Kimberly DaCosta. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, Miriam. It's really my pleasure to be able to introduce our guest today. Jude Hughes was born in a mother and baby home in Dublin in 1941. The rest of his childhood was spent in institutions. At 16, he trained as a tailor in Dublin, where he continues to serve the community with his craftsmanship. In the 1980s, Jude became a founding member of Harmony, one of the first anti-racism groups in Ireland, and has continued that work ever since. Chair of the Association of Mixed-Raced Irish, most recently, Jude was honored at the Black and Irish Gala Awards when the inaugural Jude Hughes BIG Award was awarded to the poet, playwright, and performer, Feli Speaks. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Kim. It's always wonderful to have you here with us. And I suppose we should let you speak, Jude. And thank you for being here with us today and for your interest in sharing your story through this medium. It's wonderful and a real pleasure to share your story with this audience.
Hello, good evening, Kim. Thank you for inviting me to be a guest on this immense occasion and speaking for the first time to the African American diaspora. It is lovely at last to be able to link with our brothers and sisters across the pond.
Well, Jude, you know, it's our pleasure and an honor to share your story, especially because the work that you've done has built over a long period of time. But I suppose for the benefit of those who don't know your story, Kim introduced you there and told us a little bit about your early years and how you came to be the Jude Hughes you are today. But can you tell us a little bit about growing up in a mother and baby home and your the early part of your life, and I suppose the ways in which your ancestry as being of Irish and African descent shaped your early experiences?
Well, first of all, as I said, I was born in the mother and baby home. And when you entered these places, you ended up in these institutions from there till you were 16. You went from the baby home, then into an orphanage, then into an institution, industrial school as you grew older, and then gradually you learned trades in these industrial schools. And you were there, usually most people were there until they were 16. So I was in that situation back then.
So you would have been essentially given up for adoption, or sorry, not given up for adoption, but placed in this institutional system. And
Yes.
anyone familiar with, you know, Irish social history in the 20th century will be familiar with that. But just to make sure for anyone tuning in terms of not knowing that history, so you were placed into that care, and essentially because your parents weren't married, right? And I suppose the complicating factor for you was your ancestry.
Well, technically, if I was to be honest, 99.9 families would reject having a black baby back in the early 40s and 50s then. So you can understand that situation back then.
So you went through this system then basically until you were 16, as you explained, Jude. You know, what was that like for you? What was the lived experience of going through that system like?
It was a mixture of both. There were some beautiful people in these places that really took care of you, but there were others who were, you can call them monsters, who thought their job was to bully you and prove that they were the boss and would end up beating you for the least trivial excuse they had. But you learned how to be streetwise, and I certainly did. You got very little chance to do this to me. I know that.
And would you have been the only child who looked like you in those institutions that you came across? Well,
to understand, I was, like, you've got to remember, I was born in 41. So I would have been as rare as a gold in this country, because you could count the amount of black people that were in Ireland at that time. Only a handful of black students studied in Ireland back in those days, mainly as medical doctors and lawyers. In fact, they were the only people who came to the country back then. And it was, you could say, basically they were sons of chiefs and well-off people. In fact, that's the only way they got in back then.
And actually that intersects with your story, Jude, right? Because if memory serves me correctly, your father was one of these medical students who had come to study in Ireland. Is that, am I remembering that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. So, so when you, I mean, would you have experienced much, would you say, in what we would describe as racism in terms of the institutions when you were coming up, or were you treated differently?
Well, put it this way, you probably didn't know what racism was, but you were aware of sometimes when you were left out of events and you couldn't understand why you weren't allowed to go here or there. Sometimes people went somewhere and you'd be pulled out of the line, oh, you can't go. But you wouldn't understand why. But then eventually you realized what it was.
would you say then, Jude, when you came to Dublin, I suppose when you were 19, so when you were 16, how prepared were you for life out in the world, and how did you make that transition?
Well, as you know, when you leave these institutions, I say, back then, back then there was no social people looking out for you or anything. So, as the old saying goes, you learn to sink or swim. And I knew I had to stay on my feet, and so you'd put up with a lot of things that you wouldn't normally put up with so that you could survive, because you had to survive paying the rent for your apartment or flat or hostel, and then there was no safety net for you if you ever lost your job. So that kind of put you in a situation that you couldn't afford to slip up. And in a way, it kind of toughened you up and you learned how to survive. Now, not everybody did this. It was very tough for lots of people. And lots of them cracked up. Lots of them emigrated to England, because there was no social welfare to look and see how you're getting on, or where you've been treated right at your employment,
There were no social workers coming to check on you after anything like that, right? And then you had no family network like most other people of your age would have, right?
Yes, that was a serious problem with lots of people who left these institutions. Now, sometimes you'd be lucky if you met a lovely family. And I think I was very lucky that way. I met two families, the Smiths family and the Leonard Kelly family at Whitwood Road. And they took interest in me, and I think that helped to steady me a bit.
And what, you'd go and stay with them?
I would stay weekends. I'd go up and I remember the first time I was up, the first Christmas, I would have been staying in a hostel, and these people came up and said, "Oh, Sister so-and-so sent me to ask you, would you like to join us for Christmas?" Because that was her brother, and that was the Smith family. So for about another 20 years, I went up there for Christmas,
Wow.
And that was the good side of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, when I left the hostel, the Leonards asked me would I like to stay up with them. So it wasn't like I was paying, but it wasn't an issue of paying. They're just glad to have me in the house as like part of the family. So that was nice.
Jude, when you walk around Dublin today, when we're out on the streets there outside, it's you see every color, you see every creed, it's such a unrecognizable place, even from, say, the 80s Dublin that I remember. But you came to Dublin in the 1950s. Were you very conscious of how the difference that you presented in terms of your appearance?
Yes, I was very conscious. Like, let's put it this way. You found it hard to socialize, let's say, with the opposite. After all, 99.9 were white people, So, but I ended up joining sports clubs. I was in a band, and I joined an OIGA. So I got into a lot of activities.
Okay.
And gradually into tennis and squash and badminton,
And they were ways that kind of connected you.
Basketball as well. Of course, I always played basketball back in the early days, even at school. So they were great ways to break through barriers. I always considered sport as one of the best ways. And people don't see your color. They almost expect you to be great because they're looking at all these great black athletes. And I remember in my young days, some fella, especially in the school days, some fella would say, "Oh, who do you think you are? Do you think you're Joe Luce or this person? And I'd have to fight as if I was Joe Luce, even if I wasn't.
You added pressure.
I got many a battering, but I couldn't let the honor of Joe Luce die. So I had to stand up for him.
To live up to the reputation. So let me ask you, Jude, I feel like as you maybe got into your 20s, into the 1960s, things that were going on in the other parts of the world, you kind of watched. And I suppose in this context, in the context of our conversation today, what's going on in America with the civil rights movement. Tell me about those developments for you.
Yeah, because I always remember, and when you were young, people loved Black people because there were so few of them. So you'd be getting sweets patted on the head, and you have this impression, oh, everybody loves Black people. But as you get older, you start reading. I remember reading the first book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and few of these, and I was horrified at people I did not quite know how real bad laws were back in America, because they never talked about the details of it. And you thought, oh, that's the way it was, you know. But slowly you realized this was appalling. And then during the 60s, as I said to people, the African continent was beginning to start saying, come on, we need our freedom, we want our independence. The civil rights started getting going again, even though I had some admirers like Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was pre-Martin Luther, and I remember looking at his showdown with the investigation commission into his exodus going around Europe. And when he mentioned that he was treated better in Europe and in Russia than he was in America, and then they hauled him up for that. Imagine being hauled up for speaking against that. I couldn't understand that. Also, I couldn't understand the race laws they had down in the deep south. They could 1 minute talk about everybody's equal in God's eyes, but it seems some areas the whites were more equal to than the others, and these people could run for America in the Olympics. They could fight for America, and then they'd come back and they were second, third class citizens. I couldn't understand how one section of the community could dehumanize another race of people, and saw nothing wrong with that. And from us on this side, we were appalled that there were actual laws that allowed that. And that was going on for 100 years, and nobody saw anything wrong with that. And to this day, I'm still puzzled with all their intellectual intelligence that they allowed this to go on for that length of time. Mm-hmm. And then when they marched peacefully to look for their civil rights, they battered them down as if they were dogs, not even dogs. You wouldn't even do what they did to the dog, and they did, and they saw nothing wrong with that. And then I could correlate that when in Ireland, Northern Ireland, they marched for their civil rights, and the police battered them down too. So there is a correlation between the two, and all because of basic human rights, you know? Mm-hmm. So, of course, that made me stronger and stronger. And then I got involved with the anti-apartheid movement. And remember, the 60s, there was a great, as I say, a great flame arising around the world for freedom everywhere. The African continent, and the same with the anti-apartheid, the same with civil rights. So there was an unstoppable flame that nobody was going to quench this time. This time, nobody was going to say, you can't have it. And eventually, but look at the cost.
So the anti-apartheid movement here in Ireland, Jude, was important to you in terms of activism and organizational kind of connections?
Yes, well, you feel, even though it was happening in South Africa, you feel that that was being done to you, even though you were in a free island. But I felt the pain that was happening in South Africa. I felt the pain that was happening in the southern states in America. And I just couldn't believe it was hurting me to see that, because I felt when they were being beaten and that, I felt I was being beaten.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So then from there, Jude, maybe we would jump a little bit forward to, Kim mentioned in the introduction, harmony. And, you know, I know some people who grew up as kids attending harmony events and how important it was. Will you describe the organization and how it came about and what you did with that, Jude?
Yes. During the end of the anti-apartheid movements, where Tony French and Marion Tannum, we had a meeting. Tony French was very high up in the anti-apartheid, married to a lady from Trinidad, and Mary had a kid from Ghana. But Tony spoke to me about do I have problems with racism, and I said to him, well, I've often had remarks, and he asked me, what do I do? And I said, what can I do? And he says, I said, sure, if I was to react every time a remark was passed to me, I would end up fighting for the rest of my life. And, you know, I just ignored him and got on with whatever I was doing. And he said, well, when you have kids, you might be able to do that. And he explained to me that some kids are being bullied, and so much that it's affecting them studying, it's affecting them growing up. They don't want to be involved in anything because they're being hassled. And he said to me, what about calling a meeting? And I said, okay, call a meeting and let's see what it's going to be. What kind of, let's test the scene and see, is it as bad as we think it might be? So we called a meeting in 86 in Wynn's Hotel, 3 o'clock. And when they turned up, I could hardly get into the room, it was so packed. And after I came out, after that meeting, I came out shocked. While I was enjoying myself on a tennis or basketball team or this and that and the music and having a grand time, there were people committing suicide, people saying when they grow up at 16 they're going to get the hell out of this country. Others were saying they hate Ireland because of what was going on. And I realized I couldn't believe this was going on around me. So we then formed a committee, and at that committee meeting, the question was, what do we call it? Harmony. So that's how the name Harmony came about. And
what did you do then, Jude?
We then decided the first thing to do was draw up a collection of stories and sent them to the newspapers, and had meetings with TDs, linked up with meetings with the travelers and the gay community. And eventually we made a move to get, there were no race laws pre-86. So we handed a dossier to the then Minister of Justice, Ray Burke, around 89, 90. And he then made a promise that they'd bring in new race laws. And after 1990, there was a new minister appointed, Mervyn Taylor, and that was the first minister for law and equality. And then we got some of the laws passed that we wanted. Now, we didn't get, as I said, everything we wanted, but it was a start. Now, our other way of dealing with it was, you can't be complaining about racism all the time, is help people to understand the different cultures of other countries so that they could help them, because there was a lot of ignorance. And as we know, even nowadays, they're now beginning to bring in African education. Before, there was none of that. So we ran cultural evenings, and they ended up a great success. and it didn't matter whether it was an African country. We've had Mexican evening, Japanese evening, and half of the countries up the African continent, the Egyptian evening. And a lot of the ambassadors came in on it and joined in, and they were delighted with this idea because we were promoting their country, but we were also helping them to understand the cultures of these countries. And people then used to come and say, Jude, this is great. When is the next one? And it made them see these countries in a different light. And that was another way to help to break down barriers. Because, as you know, there was a lot of myths about Africa and about a lot of countries through, I blame the media, I blame Hollywood. If you know the early films of Hollywood, the way they portrayed the original native Indian population and the African population, they were talking as if they were savages. And nowadays, I know they wouldn't dare make a film today like that. So that's another help. And they began to show the real humanized stories of these countries. And that has changed the perspective of these countries. And more of that needs to be done. Because, as you know, African history was taught as if these ships just came around and just suddenly found the continent of Africa. And they didn't know it was there until they found it. And another stupid myth that it was empty when they arrived, you know?
Harmony demonstrates so well, Jude, you know, and we see it time and time again. And actually, Kim DaCosta's work on the American side, speaking about the importance of organizations and networks where you bring people together. I mean, you give such a rich example, Jude, in that there are people out there, there were kids, you know, suffering racism and bullying and all this. And for whatever reason, you yourself were quite protected, or you felt protected from it. Even you didn't realize what was going on. But when you brought people together, it, you know, gives power to the collective voice, right? And all that great work that Harmony did to give voice to minorities.
Yes, well, it was the need, because I found if you keep harping on the problems of racism, people kind of get fed up with it. But if you can show positive sides of these countries and cultures, the whole thing changes, the whole scene changes. And I know now people look on some of these countries and the people and the races and even the Native American Indians. I know when I visited America, I made it my business to visit the Indian Museum and get some of their lovely books on the dream catcher and some of its history written by Indians. And the same, I'd love if we could follow African history written by Africans, not from a European or British or French context.
And that's something, Jude, that strikes me as well. You're always, you're a great man for books and learning about the history of people of African descent. You know, you put a lot of store in, you know, books and education as a tool, right?
Yeah, because you got to remember, when I was young, we were given the impression as if the people had to go out there to save Africa and civilize them. And, you know, I even nearly believed that as a kid, because that's the way I was taught. That only realize that the opposite happened. The ones who were uncivilized were the colonial people who committed nothing but genocide. And they came back with these stories, pretending that they were attacked by savages. And there was no modern day journalist out there to believe it. So they got away with these stories. And these stories are still stuck in the memories of a lot of the English. And of course, Ireland is part of this population because they did, whether Ireland like it or not, part of the British Empire was made with a mixture of England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And Ireland played their part in the British Empire. So no point in the Irish saying they hadn't any part in it. Have a look at some of the great Irish regiments who loved parading on the British battles they had in India. And some of them were disgraceful, like the massacre in one of these towns where it was led by an Irish guy. Then there you had the Munster, you had the Connaught Rangers in India, you had the Dublin Fusiliers, South Africa, Sudan, you know. So they were part of the British colonialism, you know. Britain on its own could not have conquered an empire without the help of Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales. And Ireland was one of their second best recruiting grounds.
So no, we were definitely, I think there has been a tendency for the Irish narrative to separate us out of that colonial history. And you're absolutely right, Jude, in calling that out, because we're not exempt from some of the awfulness of that history. Let me ask you, Jude, you know, demographically, the last 25, 30 years, Ireland has changed phenomenally in terms of the number of people from elsewhere coming here. You know, historically, you know, we've been a country of emigration, and for the first time in recent modern history, we became a country of immigration. You've been tailoring here in Dublin all these decades. You're here in the city centre. You see the changes. Tell us about the experience of seeing those changes.
Yes, I remember when I had started, I would say 99.9 were Irish. And gradually, I noticed more and more migrants beginning to stay in Ireland, come to Ireland to stay. And in one way I was delighted, because I used to feel lost out there on my own. And now suddenly I was having lots of my African people come stopping me and saying, "Hello, brother, how are you?" You know? I said, God, I didn't know I had all these brothers. And I liked the way they greeted you without any question. They just, once you were their color, that you were their brother, full stop. I don't remember any whites stop me and saying, "Hello, brother."
So, so, you know, in that sense, then you were, you know, kind of feeling less of a minority. But how would you reflect back, Jude, on, you know, how Ireland has dealt with the changes of becoming a country of immigration? And I suppose the most recent, you know, recent developments in terms of, you know, Black Irish identity becoming more prominent, and then the backlash against that in some instances.
Yes, it's ironic. Ireland was a country of migration, and now the country is depending on immigration, and they're going to be in the same position as England and even America. If they didn't have this immigration, the country would collapse. I've just noticed that in the medical field, in the nursing, and in a lot of care places, if they didn't have these migrant workers, Ireland would be in serious trouble. I cannot understand why that is. The Irish people who qualify as doctors and nurses all seem to go over to Australia, Dubai, Canada, America. And plenty of them qualified, but they all go. So that's left an opening for some of the migrants to come here, immigrants to come here, and there's an opening for them. And now the country is literally depending on them. So there shouldn't be that problem. After all, when the Irish had problems from the days of after the famine to the times there was recessions, they had no trouble going abroad to Australia and America. And as soon as a few come here, look at what's happening. There are a few scenes now where they're protesting over immigrants coming. And the problem they have is they're doing it to the wrong people. They're protesting against the people who can't do anything about it. And the problems they have of being homeless has nothing to do with them. It's got to do with the government. You know, when they sold some of their council lands to these so-called developers who reneged on building the social housing, and it's them they should be protesting, because they should never been allowed to do that. And to this day, some of these developers won't build places unless they get 60-70% of the council land, so that they will build 30% of social housing. It's them they should be protesting against, because that's not acceptable. But some parties are agreeing to let them do that. And I'm glad there's others who won't let them do that, because it should be the opposite, 70 or 80% city council or council apartments, and not the other way. And it's appalling that after the investigation into the Maha Tribunal, that there's still people think that these developers should get away with this. That's where the problem is.
Do some of the, you know, events of recent days and weeks in terms of, you know, essentially some activity that you can, you know, we only see usually in the context of far right has become prevalent in a way, in a you know, open way that I don't recall in recent history, Jude.
Yes, I find now, I begin to notice if any Black person makes a stand and puts their head above the parapet, they end up being literally abused on social media. And even if they didn't, just recently we had a case where Emer O'Neill made a stand about some incidents, and instead of dealing with the issue she raised, they started attacking her, and she began to be abused and demeaned and threatened. And then recently I heard also Emma Debris, and that other runner for the lady Adikeli, I mightn't pronounce her name, Adikeli, have been picked on. And I even remember there was a lovely, about 2 or 3 years ago, a lovely Afro-American who went to the trouble of learning how to do Irish dancing from being inspired by river dance.
Yeah, Morgan Bullock.
And she then put that on. And as soon as that happened, she got picked on and abused. But I was delighted that River Dance organization made her an offer to be part of the company when they're visiting America. So that was the way to deal with that.
Well, it's so important, Jude, that you mention all this in the context of how people want to define Irishness as only meaning people who look like me, instead of it also embracing people who look like you, right? And this instinct by some to try and contain Irishness, when you know and I know that, like all identities, you know, it's fluid, it's contingent, it's based on people's, you know, no one has a right to dictate in that way.
And a lot of people seem to know that most Europeans are descendants from Africa. There has been proof of that. Is it Kenya? The connection with the girl called Susie. I don't know the full details, but I remember coming across it sometime. So whether they like it or not, they do have African connections, most Europeans.
So the likes,
So they could be our cousins and they don't know.
yeah. Well, the work that, you know, Emer and Emma and some of the wonderful athleticism of some of the Black athletes and some of the Black Irish soccer players representing at the highest echelons of sport. And I'm not being exhaustive in that list at all. It's so important to see those examples, but the conundrum in terms of representation is the viciousness with which people are being attacked, especially on social media and beyond.
I think if they do well, let's say any of them win a gold medal, I think that'll help to get, but they shouldn't have to win a gold medal to get the respect of these people. Like I always remember Paul McGrath. They adored him, and he was great. And Phil Lynott of the musical group Tin Lizzy. Now, he was very popular with people. Now, they just saw his ability, not his color. And if people just look at people's ability, like that beautiful runner Adeleke, and these people who are inspiration. I remember looking at Emer O'Neill's TED Talk, and it was phenomenal. And, you know, they're all basically human beings are the same everywhere. It's just that people decide to degrade one section above the others against it and keep them down there. Now, the Irish have to remember, they should know better. They were treated like this one time, and they needed to get up the ladder. And to their success, they did do well, but then they should remember what it was like when they were treated like second-class citizens. There was one time, even in America, they were treated like second-class citizens, but they broke through that. But everybody is entitled to improve themselves and improve their conditions. Everybody wants the best for their families. That's all it is. You know, who are one group to say you're not entitled to improve your conditions? If you're living under heroin, you'll move where you can live in a better life. That's all people want, you know?
Let me ask a question on that, because when you came to Dublin, and a lot of your peers and people who had gone through the industrial system, a lot of them went to England, right? Can I ask you how fortunate we are that you didn't make that move? But why? There must have been times where you said, you know what, it would be easier somewhere else. What kept you in Dublin?
Actually, I nearly went to England. I remember there was an advertisement looking for bus drivers from the London transport. And I remember answering it, and I got called up for an interview. And it was just simple bits of primary stuff, adding, subtraction of that. About 2 minutes, I was standing up, throwing the paper into them. And they then said, right, go to this person, and said, oh, yes, Taylor, you're Taylor. And he says, you speak very good English, you know. They were looking at me as if I shouldn't be speaking good English. And oh, yes. And then they said, go into the next room. And in the next room was a lady. And she says, oh, yes, you got top marks. And I see you're a tailor. And of course, I had this lovely suit on me, you know, when you go for interviews. And she says, did you make that suit yourself? And I said, I was proud as punch. She said, yes. Oh. And you know what she said to me? There's no way you're going to be a bus driver or a conductor. And I said, what makes you think that? She said, anyone that can make a suit like that, there's no way he's going to end up. He says, I tell you what you're planning to do. You want to use the London transport and look around to see if you can fit into some Savile Row place, because you need a place to hang on to till you have a look around, see where you can fit in. I couldn't believe it. That's exactly the way I was thinking. I was using that as a safety belt until I had figured out where I could fit in.
So you just came back to
She,
Ireland?
no, I didn't go back. No, the interview was in the Gresham Hotel
Oh, it
here.
was here. Oh, it was
And
here.
I couldn't believe she had me sussed.
Wow.
She was a psychologist. In fact,
Wow.
that's the biggest, I won't say it was a mistake. You know, the way everybody tells you to dress up for interviews. If I went in as a tramp, I'd have got the job. Because I dressed up so well, she knew there's no way I was going to.
But you love Dublin? You like living in Ireland? I mean, it's all you've ever known, I suppose.
Yes, well, everybody can't be running away. You know, I mean, that's the easy way out, you know, because, yeah, people did feel lost and fitting in, you know, but now that's much easier today now. And I look at my kids and I look at the way they mingle and they're on teams and they play and they pile of friends. And it's lovely. You don't, once this thing of color doesn't come into it, you know, that needs to be got rid of around the world, you know, because they seem to define you. You know, you have to be white or Caucasian, otherwise you won't be acceptable.
Jude, can I ask you, when you first heard about the African American Irish Diaspora Network and you were involved in the Association for Mixed Race Irish, I remember you were quite happy and intrigued that an organization of that kind of remit or mission had come together. Am I remembering that correctly?
I was delighted because I often wondered how quite a lot of these Americans have lovely Irish names, you know, and I was curious to see where the connection is because there are one or two Caribbean islands that have the same thing. And I know Jamaica has a great Irish connection because of Cromwell deporting some of the Irish. So I remember at a meeting in Geneva, one of the Jamaicans made it well known to the minister that you mess up with the mixed race in Ireland, you mix up with us because we also are Irish, she said. And the place stood up and gave her a round of applause. I was delighted to hear her say that. Now, in America, you hear the names, you know, even I know Mariah Carey made a big thing of being Irish. And I believe Beyonce Knowles has an Irish connection. And of course, Obama, you have, who else? A lot of the stars.
Muhammad Ali.
You know, although some of them go back to the days of slavery. But there is little Irish connection with these, and some of them are now beginning to come out and be proud of their Irish connection. So I think it would be lovely if we did have a great connection with the Irish American, Afro-American Irish as well, because someday you might be able to come over and pray down O'Connell Street. That should be interesting if that happens.
That would be great. Well, Jude, you know, I mean, harmony was, you know, ahead of its time in terms of, you know, some of the great work being done in the UK, you know, Lorraine Marr's great work, and the guys working on Black Irish here. Yes. And some of the stuff coming out of the States is so it's in the vein of harmony.
Oh, there's a great amount of organizations now. It's kind of the other day I couldn't, when I was speaking at that Black and Irish, there's Akita, there's I Am Irish, there's the Black and Irish. There's so many of them now. It's great. And you can see, and there is an organization called IDPAD, and all these different groups from each of these are on that. And at the moment, we're celebrating the decade of African contribution to Europe. And all these have got together, and down now, because of COVID, they weren't able to launch properly, but we're hoping this year to launch it. And there's going to be some interesting events coming from that. And I was delighted when our group linked up with IDPAD, because that gave us a chance of meeting all the different African groups. And they certainly have accepted our group as well openly. So that we've linked up back to Africa. Now we hope to link up to America, you know.
And you keep going. You could sit back now if you wanted to and relax a little. What motivates you to keep going and keep active in all this?
Well, it's not a question keep active. I mean, the job is not finished. There's a lot, as I often hear the political party says, there's a lot done, but there's a lot more to be finished.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much for your questions and comments. I'm wondering if you'd like to just, Jude, finish out, you know, did you, in the end, were you able to, did you track down your parents in terms of, I suppose, for many of us, a sense of identity and who we are? Do you just want to round out that a little bit?
Yeah. There is also another sad part of being in institutions. A lot of people let go through these without proper idea, and then when they came out, they wanted to know more about their background, and for some unknown reason you couldn't get it. I remember one time saying, if you wanted information about yourself, I said you'd have easier chance of getting the information from CIA and KGB than from the government here in Ireland. And I discovered that they had acts in law. If someone agreed that they wouldn't give the information, that was it. Whereas in every country around the world, once you hit 16, you're entitled to every bit of your information. And there was a big inquiry, the Judge Murphy inquiry. And I remember we went before, and after giving what we would connect with, what our problems were, I just said to Judge Murphy, why are we not being given this information? And why are some things redacted and this and that, under Act this and under Act that? And she just said, oh, that was challenged in the High Court back in the early 80s and it was upheld. And then I said to her, is that in the Constitution? And said, no. Well, then I says, European law overrides what's not in the Constitution. And she said, yeah. So therefore I says, oh, this is illegal. And she said, oh, I must talk to the government about this. But I says, it's not a question of talking to the government. It's a question, it's illegal, full stop, you know. And only about 2 years ago, they passed a law letting everybody have their rights. Now, that wasn't the problem. This thing was illegal 50, 60 years ago. Yeah. And everybody who wanted to find out, some of them, when they found out their mother might have only died 6 months ago, they were told their mother was dead 30 years, 40 years. I mean, they were fed a lot of lies. And this was a problem. So besides being an institution, they added another 30 to 40, 50 years of misery onto these people. So that was an extra punishment. And it was an utter disgrace. And nobody, no attorney general, nobody in the government said, this is wrong. It's like what happens in the United States with the illegal laws against it. Nobody should have said it 50 or 100 years ago, this is wrong. Yeah. They allowed it to go on. And look at the amount of people. That to me was worse than the institution, to have laws depriving you of your identity.
So were you unable to track down your parents?
I did, eventually, we did. But I went the old way, the DNA way. And I've got now full information of my background. But no thanks to the government. And they had that information. Lots of them got their information in the last few months because of this release. But it should have been given to them 30, 40, 50 years ago. And they've never apologized for this, you know, and the arrogance of them. And even today, they're still tidying up these and they're dragging their heels, you know.
And we have some questions on that, Jude, and apologies that I'm coming late to the questions and comments, and thank you for engaging with us in this way. Terry asks, wonder if we will ever see a truth commission in Ireland. Today, mothers and their children from institutions are being treated as less than human. Very few will qualify or be given a medical card. These are the practical implications as well. Great to hear your words, Jude. We must keep the conversation alive. Well done. They're so important, and that's a great observation, Terry. Thank you for sharing. Stephanie, just thank you for this program. I'm a scholar who works on Charles W. Chestnut, an African-American writing in the 1890s to 1910. There was Irish in his family, and one of his daughters married a man whose mother was Irish. He often has Irish characters in his stories. Thanks for sharing that. That's wonderful. Is there anywhere to see some of his work design in advance? Thank you in advance. Great discussion. We'll tell you where to find you there on Midlabby Street if you ever need any of his wonderful craftsmanship. He's so talented. Someone else says you look very much like my grandfather, Roy Tibbs. Bruce says it's a lovely exchange.
And to the Mr. Tubes in Sidney Potter's film.
Oh yeah, good remark. I'm going to come up to the top of Clena's remarks there. Thomas Carty, could you tell us more about your parents? We just answered that. Emer O'Neill's on here. Much love, Jude. You're an amazing man, and thank you for all the work you do here in Ireland for our ethnic minority community. You have paved the way. So true. Thank you for that, Emer, and for being on. And we have Clena. Sorry, I'm coming to the start of your comments. My 83-year-old uncle was in letterfrack until 16 years. He was taught no trade at letterfrack. I don't know whether you were at letterfrack at all.
No,
right?
Actually, I considered letterfrack. By coincidence, I was at a concert just last night in the Abbey Theatre, Damien Dempsey, and he mentioned about his father being in letterfrack. And even through, it was a fantastic show, but he talked about the institutions, and I was delighted that he brought it up in the show and how appalling they were. And Letterfrack and Artane were literally evil in every sense. And I was lucky I didn't end up there.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Kim, I've unmuted you there. I don't know whether you want to turn your video on and come back in or anything and join us.
Wow, this is an amazing conversation. I'm just learning so much, but also filled with a real sense of gratitude, Jude, for the work that you've done. It's really kind of just, we know that these are complicated histories, but when someone talks about it who's experienced it in the way that you have, but also your ability to kind of make the connections within the diasporas, the Irish and African, it's really moving to me. As I'm listening, I was wondering what you have to say about the things that still need to be done. You've mentioned this a few times, and I was kind of curious how effective you think, since 1990, the establishment of a minister that was focused on issues of race, how effective that has been.
Yeah, well, the problem was in the 90s, we had a minister for law and equality. Now, what happened later on, they dropped that situation and put it back into the Department of Justice as a little section, so that there was no minister for law. In other words, the Minister of Justice was also the Minister for Law and Equality. And as a result of that, it got demoted. Now, today, we have a Minister for Law and Equality, but he's also the Minister for Law and for Children as well. Now, we think there should be, at this stage now, especially now with a bigger ethnic group in Ireland, that they need a Minister for Law and Equality, because we didn't get everything we wanted back in the 80s. There's certainly a situation where we're asking the government to consider a hate crime. That needs to be dealt with. And we're beginning to see this rise again. Anytime people put their head above the parapet, they end up, the person who sends the message about what happened ends up being vilified and insulted and degraded just for questioning some racism that happened somewhere. And how dare you talk like that? Get back to your country. You all are the same, and and it just gives the social media an excuse to just. So you realize there's a lot of hidden stuff. So they need to deal with hate crime because it is getting serious. Now, we've had, even today, I know people back in the 80s committed suicide. We've had a few committed suicide in the last few years for the same thing. And it needs to be dealt with today. Now, we need a proper Minister for Law and Equality because they're not doing their job. If they did, some things would be done.
Yeah, I think your portfolio is too big for the minister.
Many a person has reported situations to the guards, but nothing happened. I all felt sorry for that lady down in Tipperary, only 16 years. She had reported what was happening to her and nothing was done. She ended up committing suicide, 16 years of age.
There's a lot of work still to be done, Jude, and
a lot to be done.
You have to, what you've done, and you inspire us all. And it's such an honor to do this with you today. You're such a great man. Your resilience, your humility, your intelligence, and the way you conduct yourself in all these spaces is so inspirational. Thank you for allowing me to share your story with this audience, Jude. And I hope we can get you over to New York, to the African American Irish Diaspora Network soon, because more people need to hear your story. Kim, thank you for being on with us. I look forward to you and Jude meeting in person, hopefully this summer when you come to visit. And thank you for your support in introducing Jude today. Please join us in April and in May when we speak to Kip Duval and Professor Mary Burke about some of these related topics. And thank you for staying on the line. We ran a few minutes over, but I think it was worth every minute. Thank you again, Jude, and everyone have a good evening and afternoon.
Thank you, Kim. Delighted to speak to the American or Afro-American diaspora, and a happy St. Patrick's Day to you all.
Thank you. That's a wonderful way to end. Be safe, everyone.